The forest stretched endlessly, an unbroken sea of towering pines and shadowy undergrowth, its depths shrouded in a silence that felt too heavy, too unnatural. The sun, dipping below the horizon, cast a dim orange glow that filtered weakly through the dense canopy, leaving the trails below bathed in a twilight gloom. Park Ranger Ethan Marshall adjusted his hat and clicked on his flashlight, the weak beam barely penetrating the encroaching darkness. He had been patrolling these woods for 5 years, yet tonight felt different. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the usual rustling of leaves and distant chirping of crickets eerily absent. The forest, which during the day was a sanctuary of calm, now loomed around him like a living entity, watching and waiting. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Ethan's boots crunched against the gravel path as he walked toward a secluded campground. Earlier that evening, a hiker had radioed in, reporting strange noises, low growls and distant guttural howls, coming from the forest near the site. Could be coyotes, he had reassured the caller, though even then, he hadn't believed his own words. Coyotes didn't growl like that. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. A shiver crept up Ethan's spine, though the night was far from cold. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and quickened his pace, the beam flickering erratically, as though the forest itself sought to dim his vision. Shadows danced along the edges of the trees, fleeting shapes that vanished the moment he turned his light toward them. The campground came into view, 3 empty tents arranged in a rough circle, their nylon walls flapping gently in the breeze. Ethan scanned the area, his heart thumping louder than he cared to admit. The campsite looked untouched, yet something felt off. A low, almost imperceptible hum seemed to resonate through the air, too deep to be natural. It wasn't audible so much as felt, a vibration in his chest, like a distant engine rumbling just out of sight. "Hello," Ethan called out, his voice steady despite the unease clawing at him. No answer. He moved closer, sweeping his flashlight across the tents. Inside the largest one, he noticed a sleeping bag and some scattered belongings, a flashlight, a book, and an open bag of trail mix. Everything seemed abandoned in a hurry, as though its occupant had left mid-task. The hum grew louder, a throbbing pulse that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. Ethan turned sharply, the beam of his flashlight catching movement among the trees. His breath hitched. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half obscured by shadow. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated and slightly contorted, as though its joints bent the wrong way. For a moment, it didn't move, simply watching him from the darkness. "Who's there?" Ethan demanded, though his voice betrayed a quiver of fear. The figure took a step forward, the movement slow and deliberate, its head tilted to one side as though curious, its eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. They weren't human eyes, too large, too reflective, like those of an animal caught in headlights. Ethan stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, its presence radiating a sense of malice so intense it felt suffocating. Then, without a sound, it melted back into the shadows, leaving the forest silent once more. The park ranger stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run, yet his legs refused to move. The air around him seemed to shift, the faint hum now coming from every direction, encircling him like an unseen predator. He forced himself to take a step back, then another, until he was nearly at the edge of the clearing. His heart pounded as he turned and broke into a run, the beam of his flashlight bobbing wildly with each frantic step. The trail seemed endless, the trees closing in on him like prison bars. Shadows flitted just beyond his vision, always keeping pace. shapes growing more distinct with every fleeting glimpse. He could hear them now, soft whispers carried on the wind, an unintelligible chorus of voices that seemed to mock his fear. Ahead, the faint glow of the ranger station came into view, a beacon of safety in the oppressive darkness. Ethan sprinted toward it, his lungs burning, every instinct telling him to not look back. But as he reached the station's door and fumbled with his keys, he couldn't resist a final glance. The figures were there, standing at the edge of the forest, their numbers multiplying. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, unblinking, fixed on him. One of them raised a long, spindly arm and pointed, as if marking him for something far worse than death. The door slammed shut behind him, and Ethan leaned against it, gasping for air. The station felt cold, the hum now reduced to a faint vibration beneath the floorboards. He knew he was safe, for now, but the forest outside no longer felt like a place he knew. Something ancient, something malevolent had claimed it, and it was watching. Ethan sat in the ranger station, his back pressed against the cold wooden door, the heavy silence of the room amplifying the frantic beat of his heart. The faint hum that had pursued him in the forest was still there, a barely perceptible vibration that seemed to pulse through the walls and floor. It wasn't loud, but its presence was oppressive, like a warning he couldn't decipher. He forced himself to breathe, slow and steady, though every nerve in his body screamed at him to stay alert. The room was dimly lit, the single overhead bulb flickering weakly as though struggling against the suffocating darkness outside. Shadows pooled in the corners, and the small radio on the desk emitted faint static, broken occasionally by bursts of incomprehensible noise. Ethan's eyes darted toward the windows, their panes reflecting the faint interior light. Beyond them, the forest loomed, its secrets hidden behind an impenetrable curtain of night. He needed to call for help. His radio sat on the desk, just a few feet away, but the thought of crossing the room filled him with a paralyzing dread. The figures he had seen, their glowing eyes and twisted forms, lingered in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't shake. Were they still out there, watching, waiting? Summoning every ounce of courage, Ethan pushed himself to his feet and shuffled toward the desk. His boots echoed softly against the wooden floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. He reached for the radio, his hand trembling, but as his fingers brushed against it, the static suddenly cut out, replaced by silence so profound it felt deafening. Then came the sound, faint at first, like a whisper carried on a breeze, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, low and guttural, speaking words he couldn't understand. Ethan froze, his hand hovering over the radio as the voice seemed to circle the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was joined by others, soft murmurs that overlapped in an eerie, disjointed chorus. He whipped his head toward the window, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. For a moment, he saw nothing but trees and shadows, but then a shape moved, quick and fluid, darting between the trunks. It was followed by another, then another, their silhouettes barely visible, yet unmistakably inhuman. Ethan stumbled back, his flashlight shaking as the shapes gathered at the edge of the clearing, just outside the station's perimeter. The whispers grew louder, their cadence rising and falling like a macabre chant. Ethan's breathing quickened as the figures began to move, slowly advancing toward the station. Their forms became clearer in the faint light, a grotesque blend of human and animal features, their limbs elongated and their movements unnervingly smooth. They didn't walk so much as glide, him drop it in alarm. The sound was deafening, like metal scraping against metal, and it seemed to resonate within his skull. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the noise persisted, drowning out his thoughts. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. Ethan lowered his hands, his ears ringing, and looked around the room. The figures were gone. The clearing outside was empty, the forest still and lifeless. But he knew better than to think they had left. They were toying with him, drawing him deeper into their game. The hum returned, stronger now, vibrating through the floorboards and making the walls creak. Ethan backed away from the windows, his eyes darting to every shadow. The light above him flickered more violently, casting strange, shifting patterns across the room. He thought he saw movement in the corner of his eye, a shape darting past the edge of the light, but when he turned, there was nothing there. The temperature in the room plummeted, his breath fogging in the air. A faint metallic smell filled his nostrils, sharp and acrid, like blood and rust. He staggered toward the corner where his rifle was propped against the wall, his fingers fumbling to load it. The weapon felt like a fragile lifeline, its weight reassuring yet wholly inadequate against whatever was out there. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing from the walls themselves. Ethan spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but the room remained empty. The voices seemed to come closer, surrounding him, and for the first time, he noticed something odd about them. They weren't just nonsensical mutterings. They were saying his name, Ethan. The voice was low, almost tender, but it carried an undercurrent of malice that sent chills down his spine. Come outside. He shook his head, muttering to himself, trying to block it out. No, this isn't real. This isn't happening. The shadows in the room began to shift, pooling together in the center of the floor. Ethan watched in horror as they coalesced into a shape. A figure hunched and unnatural, its limbs too long and its head tilting at an impossible angle. It had no face, just a smooth expanse of darkness, but he could feel its gaze piercing into him. The rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor as the figure began to rise, its form stretching upward until it nearly touched the ceiling. Ethan stumbled back, his legs giving out as he collapsed against the wall. The figure loomed over him, its presence suffocating, and though it had no mouth, he heard it speak. "You cannot escape." The light bulb above him shattered, plunging the room into complete darkness. Ethan's scream was swallowed by the void, and the last thing he felt was the hum, vibrating through his body, pulling him into the abyss. When dawn broke over the forest, the ranger station stood silent and empty. The door hung ajar, and inside, the room was untouched, save for a single faint handprint on the window. Too large to be human, its shape etched into the glass as though burned there. The forest, as always, remained watching,